Chapter 51. Try again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As Xavier turned the head of his motorcycle in Caden's direction to break the cycle of circling round about the chief orc, hoping to find a chink in his defense, for some odd reason, the thoughts of Miss Mary, the woman who had committed suicide after being gang-raped by a band of orcs, suddenly filled Xavier's heart, and he remembered why he had chosen to embark in this mission in the first place. The thought came unprovoked out of nowhere. There had been no correlating thoughts or triggers linking that thought to him. All of a sudden, he remembered the humiliation that the poor woman had suffered at the hands of the orcs. And just like that, Xavier tore himself away from his plan to disengage. He decided to gamble on another chance. This time, he was driven not by the egotistical sense of winning, but by a fresh sense of justice. A feeling that he had somehow lost along the way. Thus, after having the perfect epiphany, Xavier steered his armor motorcycle in the direction of the steep hill. The engine roared in agreement with Xavier, and both man and machine surged forward as one towards the location of the path to the ascending hill. In spite of the fact that the gigantic form of the orc leader was in hot pursuit of Xavier, the massive orc couldn't keep up with the speed of Xavier's military-grade armor motorcycle. As the rumbling armor motorcycle raged across the terrain, once again, the machine proved its worth as a military-grade mode of transportation. Its ruggedness was a real asset in these parts. Its advantages trumped just about every other alternative. The armor motorcycle's thick sturdy tires blazed forth, triumphing over every obstacle in its path. Its powerful engine supported Xavier's weight and pushed the entire frame forward across the rocky terrain, navigating through the steep areas and maintaining its sturdiness and speed at the same time. In that very moment, there was no other mode of transportation that could rival the effectiveness of the armor motorcycle at this point. It had paid off its worth thrice over. In terms of its usefulness, the armor motorcycle had truly outdone itself despite the topography of the mountainous terrain. The orc's freakishly long legs gave it the added advantage of terrifyingly long strides. He dashed towards Xavier with all might, but still couldn't break even by bridging the gap between himself and Xavier. The closer Xavier got the top, the more he gained altitude and the more leveled the height difference between him and the chief orc. This placed the chief orc's head in Xavier's direct line of sight. Then, Xavier once again employed the same delinquent tactic he had used before, back at the orc's base camp when he had first landed. He forced his armor motorcycle to slow down from its steady speed and stopped abruptly. Xavier sharply turned his head in the direction of the orc behind him to confirm that he was still hot in pursuit. The hateful eyes of the chief orc met Xavier's own gaze, and oddly enough, Xavier was reassured. Convinced that the orc's attention was fully fixated on him, Xavier casually slid off his motorcycle and looked at the furious set of eyes of the orc leader ahead. And waved. For someone who just a short while ago had been contemplating running away to escape the wrath of the orc, this particular gambit he had just pulled off was a clear testament to the sheer power of human resolve. Bedo them without breaking eye contact for even a second, Xavier kept waving at the giant orc tauntingly, baiting him, luring him to his present location. Xavier did not stop until the orc leader was within a reasonable distance. All this while, the chief orc had been waiting impatiently for his prey to stop. For a minute, the orc leader had lost his target during the pursuit due to Xavier's incredible speed. So as his eyes searched the horizon, he found the attention-seeking Xavier casually waving his hands. As he found him, he kept his sights fully locked on Xavier, not wanting to lose him again. Unfortunately for the chief orc, that was the beginning of the end for him, though he didn't know it at the time. Brimming with overconfidence, which he had an ample amount of, especially after the last bout with Xavier, the orc leader abandoned all reason and charged in wide-eyed towards the mountainside, where Xavier had so generously indicated he was located. Still bathing in the joy of his past victory, and reveling in the fact that he was about to finally end this bout once and for all, the orc charged forth, and the very next minute, his eyes were assaulted with a vicious blast of photons from a high-intensity light that shone 10 times brighter than the full glare of the midday summer sun. The orc instinctively lifted up his arms to shield his overly sensitive eyes from the intense rays of light that were threatening to blind him. He staggered and roared once again. The pain was different from anything he had ever felt. It felt like the rays of light had burned through his retina and was actively working its way into his brain, driving him insane and ridding him of his sense of sight and ability to reason. The pain was twofold. Due to the suddenness of the attack, the pain hit him in two dimensions, mentally and physically. The chief orc was in so much pain, he literally felt like gouging out his own eyes and filling his eye sockets with snow. Xavier resisted the urge to chuckle to himself as he watched the chief orc struggle to contain the pain. Who knew a flash bang would be so effective? I should have thought of this a long time ago. It made sense. Since the orcs generally preferred to come out during the night time, it was safe to say they had very sensitive eyes. So, a flash bang would definitely do a lot of damage to eyes that have grown accustomed to operating in the dark. With no time to fool around, Xavier dashed into action knowing fully well that the chief orc's eyes would probably recover in no time. Armed with new knowledge on the weakness of the chief orc, Xavier lifted up his rocket launcher and aimed it at the chief orc. A few meters away, the orc leader was grasping his eyes and howling at the moon like a stray dog who had caught a strange bullet. The chief orc danced about on his feet, swaying from side to side, trying desperately to do something about his pain and his temporary blindness. Xavier was glad the chief orc had been incapacitated, but because of his constant back and forth, Xavier couldn't get a clear shot. Xavier waited and waited for a clear sight on the back side of the chief orc's head, but he kept swirling about like a drunk. Xavier began to suspect that the chief orc was deliberately swaying about on his feet and to avoid a long-range attack on his weak point. So, with time running out, and with the chances of the chief orc recovering increasing every minute, Xavier made an executive decision and took the shot anyway. The rocket whistled out of the launcher with a sizzling swish, streaking across the distance between them. Not daring to breathe, Xavier held his breath as he waited for the results to bring forth fruit. Unfortunately, while the rocket maintained its own projectile, the chief orc did not. He adjusted at the last second and the rocket collided with his left hand, missing the target only by a couple of inches. Xavier stared on at the explosion, hoping that the aftermath would bring him some good news. But once again, disappointment was what he got instead. The rocket had merely struck an insignificant part of the orc. His left hand bore no relevance to the actual target, which was the back of his head. There had been some damage, but nothing fatal. The sneaky chief orc soon picked up on Xavier's morbid plans. He anticipated that his blindness was only a ruse to enable the human break even with his plan to attack his weak point. So, the blind chief orc lifted up his massive axe and used the huge metal blade to shield the back of his head from any more attacks. While the orc leader strengthened his defense, Xavier on the other hand got busy. Undeterred by the original misfire, he prepared for another assault on the chief orc with another RPG. Chapter 52. It is time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The second rocket flew out with equal tenacity. It rushed towards the orc, reflecting Xavier's own urgency and vindictive zeal. Unfortunately for Xavier, the second shot also missed the target. In his defense, it wasn't for lack of skill or focus, Xavier was an excellent shot. But it seemed like the stubbornness of the giant orc was proving to be his backup shield, having lost the original metal plate that covered the back of his head. The second rocket fired by Xavier may have missed its original target, but some act of providence brought it to another point. The orc's right hand was caught in the crossfire, multiplying his pain, inevitably causing him to let go of his large axe, for that was his weapon's hand. The extraordinarily massive axe dropped to the ground with a violent thud. The impact was so impactful that it completely changed the layout of the ground. Amused, Xavier observed that in the area where the heavy axe had touched down on the earth, a massive crater had taken form there. It looked like the kind of topographical interference on Mother Nature that one would expect from a catastrophe of a much higher significance. Anyone who passed by in the future might see the crater and immediately think that it had been caused by a meteor that had crashed into the earth. Xavier took stock of the damage he had inflicted on the chief orc, and as he did, he discovered that without even trying to, he had actually managed to injure not just the toes and feet of the chief orc, he had also inflicted a reasonable amount of damage on both of his arms. If it wasn't for the unnatural tenacious build of the chief orc, he should have been incapacitated already. The damage was negligible. But that didn't mean that the pain wasn't there. The blackness of the night kept visibility to the bare minimum, but thankfully, Xavier had the soft silvery rays of the moonlight to work with. Because of the unnatural size of the giant orc, and from the vantage point where Xavier had tactically positioned himself, he had a first-hand view of the orc's reactions and movements. The chief orc tried his best to hide his pain, but the deep grunt which escaped his throat sounded like something between the cawing of a raven and the deep croaking of the amphibious toad. As he dropped the axe, he lifted up both of his hands high up above his shoulders and positioned them in a defensive position behind his head. As Xavier observed the orc's reaction, his mind quickly connected the dots, giving him a much clearer understanding of the situation. Despite the fact that both of the chief orc's hands had been obliterated by the 2 consecutive attacks of the explosive force of the rocket, despite the fact that was actively in pain from the flashbang, the RPGs, and the hidden land mines, the chief orc had still chosen to lift up his hands to the back of his head to block any further nefarious intentions that his attacker might be nurturing. Xavier took in all of this information and processed them at the speed of light. The only logical inference was that the chief orc was hell-bent on protecting the back of his head at all costs. The observation only strengthened Xavier's theory the more. If he somehow managed to strike a lethal blow, all of this would be over. In that moment, Xavier proved that hope was the ultimate drug. Every part of his mental and physical biochemistry flared up at the prospect of completely decimating this abominable foe. Faced with this tiny window of opportunity that had momentarily presented itself, Xavier knew that he had to find a way to separate the chief orc's hands from the back of his head, real fast. If his hands stayed firmly stuck to the back of his head in defense, there was little to nothing Xavier could do. He had to strike, and he had to land a lethal blow. So, in light of recent events, Xavier began to brainstorm, and soon, in no distant time, he came up with one of his classic plans that was guaranteed to ensure the best possible outcome for him. In that moment, Xavier proved that he was indeed worthy of being a part of the Special Forces unit. This kind of quick thinking was something that was a major requirement for being part of this elite unit of soldiers. Xavier had proved himself twice over. Armed with fresh resolve, and equipped with basically every relevant information there was to know about the enemy, Xavier pressed on. Victory was sitting right at the edge of the horizon for Xavier. He could feel the end of this joust drawing near. It filled him with both a climatic and anti-climatic foreboding sense of an epilogue. Meanwhile, while Xavier had been nurturing his plans and experiencing another epiphany, the orc leader slowly began to regain his sight just as Xavier had anticipated. As fate would have it, that was the very moment Xavier descended from his lofty place to charge into battle. After being temporarily blind for what seemed like an eternity, after living in the darkness of his own fear of getting blown to pieces in the one place that could end him, his eyesight began to recover. And the first thing he saw was the puny form of the human rushing daringly at him on his metal steed. The whole scene seemed farcical to the chief orc. Here he was, over 25 feet tall, hovering over the nearby trees and bearing down on all creatures in the surrounding region. And yet, the little human still dared him by choosing to charge headlong, throwing caution to the wind and surrendering himself to his wrath. He must be truly mad. But the chief orc had no time to be amused by the foolhardy audaciousness of the human. If the human was so desperate to meet his end, he would gladly be the instrument which the fates would use to kill him. The chief orc was well aware of the pressing need to safeguard the back of his head from any more crafty attacks the human would spring up on him, but he was also aware of the fact that he had one free hand which could be used to crush the daring little man. Child. All things considered, the chief orc knew that this was a pretty risky gambit, considering the fact that he would be battling with one arm literally behind his back. But this was a juicy opportunity that he just could not afford to miss. From his perspective, the little human was now within his killing range. He concluded that one arm would suffice to do the dastardly deed. A wicked sneer crept across the chief orc's face. Once again, he pictured the image of the human splattered corpse dripping with blood beneath his powerful hand. That was enough to spur him on. At that moment, only one thought was on the minds of both parties as they charged towards each other: Dioviko, it is time to end this. Each party was well and truly aware of the fact that by the end of this altercation, only one of them would be alive. But ego and all its ugly, deep-seated allotropes dominated every part of the thinking faculties, fueling their individual pride and inflaming their sense of worth even higher than they were. So, they both rushed at each other. Each passing second brought them to the conclusion of their protracted battle. The time to settle the score was long overdue. The entire host of creation within and around the region seemed to be holding their breath in anticipation of the clash between both parties. With the constellations and the heavenly bodies hanging overhead in the night sky like thousands of light bulbs littered all over the sky, and with a deathly calm that pervaded the atmosphere, the whole stage was set for the battle. Under the faithful watch of thousands of invisible peeping eyes, the battle began. What happened next can best be described in slow motion. As Xavier got closer, he leaned forward on his armor motorcycle, racing forward with increased speed. The motorcycle responded in accordance with Xavier's need for top speed and zoomed forward. Aided by gravity, he furiously descended down the slanting hillside and flew off of the cliff, briefly soaring in the air in the direction of the 20 feet tall chief orc before him. The waiting chief orc was fully prepared to welcome Xavier. As Xavier leapt out with his motorcycle, the chief orc swung his right arm midair and violently grabbed Xavier's motorcycle with a long-awaited ferociousness. At the last minute, Xavier leapt out of his motorcycle, sacrificing it as the scapegoat for the chief orc's indignation. As the chief orc's arm made contact with the motorcycle, Xavier landed on his arm, having jumped out a few moments before. Chapter 53 Flash. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Unafraid, Xavier began to dash forward along the extended arm of the chief orc with the agility of an Olympic sprinter. As Xavier quickly made his way across the chief orc's arm, with his military-grade pistol locked and loaded, he aimed at the chief orc's eye and fired. Unfortunately, the quick searching eyes of the orc had already discerned Xavier's form racing on his arm towards him like an annoying ant. Instinctively, he violently tried to shake him off, like an irritating pest that had landed on him. Thus, Xavier's aim was disturbed and his bullet missed the target. As Xavier had expected, the bullet simply grazed the rock-hard face of the chief orc instead of pulverizing his eye. He wasn't in the least bothered because he knew that the chief orc's primary priority at the moment was to defend his already exposed weakness. The moment he dared to launch an attack with his left hand was the moment he would be finished. The chief orc's next move surprised Xavier. It turned out he had severely overestimated the chief orc's desire to keep his weak spot protected. Fueled by an inordinate rage that had been compiling for a long time, the chief orc couldn't resist seizing the opportunity to crush Xavier now that he was close to him. Even if it meant briefly exposing his Achilles heel, he didn't mind, so long as he got to vent his anger on the persistent human who had managed to draw out the wrath from within him. It was a gamble he was willing to take. By the looks of things, the odds were in his favor. So, choosing to ignore the warning bell ringing at the back of his mind, the chief orc threw caution to the wind and unleashed his left arm on the human crawling along his right arm and making his way steadily to his shoulder. Every battle has its major defining point, a pivotal moment when the whole outcome of the battle was hinged on whatever would come forth from the moment. In this battle between the human and his orc counterpart, this was the defining moment. Deciding that this had gone on long enough, the chief orc unleashed the full force of his left arm on Xavier. Xavier on the other hand was well prepared for this bit. Once again, Xavier employed another delinquent measure by greeting the chief orc in a very patronizing manner, deliberately drawing his attention to him. That was the last straw for the chief orc. Every shred of doubt holding him back vanquished as he reached out in full force to grab Xavier. That's right, you simple-minded beast. Xavier thought to himself as he waited for the perfect moment. Come and meet your end. Thus, Xavier deployed another one of his favorite gear. With his hands behind his back, Xavier closed his own eyes for his own protection and threw another flashbang at the chief orc's large head after expertly detonating it. But the orc leader was already on the lookout for any other tricks his crafty opponent might deal out. This time, he was well prepared. Just in time, he countered Xavier's assault with a basic defensive maneuver. At the last moment, the chief orc recalled his arm with a terrifying quickness that one wouldn't not have expected from a beast of his size, and brought it over his face to shield his optical nerves from being assaulted by the blazing light again. He had already been through it once, there was no way he was going to allow himself fall prey to that particular gambit. The pain from the last time was the perfect souvenir that would last him for a really long time. The chief orc was right to have been apprehensive, and his prudence had paid off handsomely. But unfortunately for him, Xavier had doubled down on his tactics as well. As Xavier threw the flashbang, he waited a few more seconds before throwing something else. This time interval had made all the difference. Because the orc had been too much in a hurry to protect his eyes from Xavier's flashbang, he had hurriedly missed out on the second object that accompanied it. Just as the mysterious object left Xavier's hand, Xavier called on his trusty military system. Military system activate. Xavier yelled urgently in his mind. System online. What do you require, Major Za? Get me a para-glider now. Sensing Xavier's urgency, the military system responded accordingly with due promptness. With a fraction of a second, a swanky para-glider appeared immediately out of thin air. Xavier wasted no time admiring the ambience of the para-glider. He was on a race against time itself. He only had a 15 to 20 second window and he intended to make the best use of it. L.RG so, equipped with fresh gear that gave him the added advantage of aerial support, Xavier quickly strapped it on and sprinted towards the edge of the chief orc's gigantic right arm, then leapt high. The wind swept him away and with the rushing air whistling through his para-glider, he flew away, leaving the unenviable location that was the chief orc's right arm behind him. Just as Xavier had foreseen, the lingering effects of the flash didn't last for long, soon enough the effects soon dissipated as suddenly as they had come. And with the passing wind, they quickly passed along, leaving Xavier with a fully functioning beastly psychopath that was bent on killing him. Like a newborn child opening its eyes for the first time, the chief orc finally opened his eyes. Carefully, as if unsure of his present state, he kept his eyes half closed, half expecting Xavier to spring another one on him. But when nothing of the sort happened, he recollected himself and focused on his next assault. Back to his senses, the chief orc instantly looked at his right arm, which was the last place Xavier had been spotted. He stared and stared until he finally convinced himself that the little pest had disappeared. He frantically searched all over his body, hoping to see the decimated corpse of the human, but found nothing. Another wave of nervous apprehension overwhelmed the chief orc. This wasn't a feeling he was used to. But the ballsy human had managed to put him on his toes. Especially when he had indicated interest in the complete obliteration of the back of his skull which housed his soft spot. He knew he had to find the human at any cost. The chief orc looked everywhere. Everywhere but up above him. A couple 100 meters above ground, in the sky, stealthily wafting through the open heavens on a para-glider was the lithe form of the black-clad Xavier. He had the appearance and vibe of a human raven. But this particular raven wasn't too pleased at the moment. Gliding through the sky and soaring several meters above the towering form of the chief orc, on Xavier's face was the dark expression of a worried look. As he peered down on his adversary, he noticed that the object he had thrown after the flash bang had gone way off course. Xavier wasn't particularly pleased because his original target had been the back of the chief orc's head. That move had been instrument in setting the mood for his next plan. And yet, much to his disappointment, his projectile had been significantly off target. So, he had to adjust to the new development to accommodate his plans. Forced to deal with this glitch in his plans, Xavier navigated his Paradot glider and compelled it to move in the direction he wanted. The direction of the chief orc. In a deliberate and calculated move, Xavier hovered over the chief orc and hailed him in a voice that was loud enough to be heard several meters down. This wasn't a problem for the chief orc, primarily because as an orc, his ears were extra sensitive. "Hey you!" Xavier yelled. The orc heard Xavier's mocking voice and began to search frantically for him in the surrounding region on the ground. Much to his annoyance, the more he looked, the less he seemed to see. It was almost as if the human had vanished into this air, and yet, his voice was still very much audible in spite of his absence. Xavier watched the chief orc's frantic motions for some time. A feeling that was akin to that of pleasure resonated through Xavier's being as he watched the chief orc go into panic mode. After he had had enough, Xavier hailed him again, "Up here you dumb son of a bitch." This time, Xavier's location wasn't lost on the chief orc. His quick sensitive ears picked up the voice and placed its approximate location at an astonishing 10 meters above him. Full of disbelief and thinking this to be trap, the orc leader tilted his eyes upward and slowly cocked his head in the direction of the human's voice. Chapter 54 Over. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The confounded orc staggered in disbelief. Though he didn't believe it, it was clear as day. Right before his eyes, like some concocted apparition or a sick hallucination, was the hovering form of the human comfortably gliding in the air far above him in the open night sky. The chief orc instantly recoiled inwardly. No one needed to tell him that this was bad news. Xavier was already dangerous enough as a mere human. But now that he had taken to the skies, the chief orc knew that there was no telling what he could do. So, conscious of the fact that he was now open to a wide range of attacks from the sky, the chief orc went into automatic alert mode without any needless delay. With the chief orc now in a state of suspicious alertness, he lifted his left hand to block his left hand from another flashbang which, thanks to Xavier, he had become familiar with. But Xavier wasn't willing to go through the whole old routine again. He had a whole other plan lined up and unwilling or not, the orc chief was going to be a part of it. So, as Xavier peered down, he noticed that the chief orc's weak spot was exposed. Because of his fear of Xavier's notoriously painful flashbang, the chief orc had neglected to switch up his location. The back of the orc's leader's head was still in the same position a couple of moments ago when Xavier had thrown the object that followed the flashbang. Xavier shrugged his shoulders. Well, it's not perfect, but it's good enough for now. Satisfied with the position of things, Xavier pressed the remote control in his hands and watched the fireworks play out beneath him. Explosion is an art. These words played out again and again in Xavier's mind. And with every nanosecond that crept by, the hidden meaning behind this phrase became clearer and clearer. Like the unsteady calm that pervades the surface of the ocean right before a storm, an eerie feeling of calm gripped Xavier before the debacle occurred. Click. That was the sound of Xavier hitting his remote control. It was pretty ironic that this such a tiny, almost meaningless sound could give birth to a devastating explosion of such proportion. The chief orc had no time to react. If he had known that the soft morbid click he heard was the sound that would herald the destruction that followed, maybe he would have had at least enough time for one last thought. But alas! It was way too late even before it was late. Boom! It wasn't so much about the deafening roar as it was the feeling of utter hopelessness that followed. Above the chaos, hovering in the air, Xavier watched his art unfold from a safe distance. There was no doubt that this attack had struck home. There was no shred coincidence in this attack. This highly desirable outcome was a result of Xavier's stunning plans and beautiful execution on his part. The crushing explosion ravaged the intended target, which was the back of the chief orc's head. Xavier could only imagine the destruction his little bomb had wrought at the back of the chief orc's head. It turned out that he didn't need to let his imagination run too wild. The chief orc, whose face reflected the total embodiment of confusion, stood dazed for a second. It had all happened way too quickly for him to follow. So, it took the unfortunate orc about 10 full seconds to recognize the fact that the explosion which he had heard and felt had actually occurred behind him. A fresh wave of apprehension overcame him like a sudden burst of cold air on a freezing winter's night. There and then, even though he could neither explain nor understand it, the chief orc knew that trouble was afoot. Instinctively, he lifted his heavy left arm to the only spot on his entire physiological makeup that mattered. The back of his head. As he lifted up his arm, it suddenly felt like his arm was made of iron. The chief orc struggled to grasp why this was so. Eventually, after a great deal of effort, the chief orc was finally able to lift up his arm to defend the one vulnerable spot he had on his otherwise impressive and vulnerable form. The chief orc's motive behind lifting up his hand to the back of his head was simple. To protect that spot from any more of the little human's tricks. But once again, the unfortunate orc was about several seconds too late. He was yet to realize that the deed had already been done, and much like every other action in the universe, it couldn't be reversed. So, still in his own timeline that was lagging by about a full minute, the chief orc reached out to the back of his head and froze. The first thing he felt was a coruscating thick, warm liquid, gushing down with the soft intensity of trickling rainfall. Orcs were generally hard to read, but at this moment, without doubt, the facial expression on the face of Chief Orc was one of pure dread, tinged with blatant shock. With a look of horror, the Chief Orc frantically searched for the source of the liquid trickling down the back of his forehead. The concept of blood was foreign to the Chief Orc, especially from a region that had always remained protected from external attacks. So, it took him a while to fully digest the fact that this was actually his own blood and none other. A fresh look of horrid surprise registered on his face as he struggled to come to terms with his new situation. His eyes flared open in bewilderment as the severity of his condition slowly began to dawn on him, but regrettably, the chief orc came to realize the truth a little too late. Xavier watched as the first stage of the explosion's effect began to manifest. Just as soon as the chief orc realized that the gig was up for him, his body was thrown into a violent fit of convulsion. The massively huge body of the chief orc began to shake sporadically as though he had been overcome by a strange force that was outside of his control. Unable to control himself, like a drunk, the chief orc staggered around on his feet, fighting desperately not to fall down. For he sensed that if he were to finally fall down, he would never get back on his feet. Sensing that the end was near, a catatonic fear gripped the chief orc, completely robbing him of all his psychomotor abilities and impairing his judgment as well. His eyes began to gradually lose its light and his head felt woozy. Finally, after fighting a tough battle against biochemistry, the gigantic form of the chief orc eventually gave in to his devastating injury. Gravity stepped in eagerly and facilitated the collapse of the gigantic beast. Like a huge ancient tree that had been cut down at its roots, the body of the chief orc slumped to the ground. If the chief orc had slumped in the middle of the ocean, the impact of his collapse on the water would have been enough to trigger a mini typhoon. As the huge body of the orc crashed down on the earth, shockwaves of heavy tremors reverberated throughout the surrounding area. If Xavier had been on the ground at that time, there was no doubting the fact that he wouldn't have escaped unscathed. Such was the ferocity of the impact. The loud crash was followed by a series of other quakes that had been triggered by the catastrophic fall of the chief orc. Out of the hillside, which formerly held Xavier and his armor motorcycle, came tumbling down huge boulders. It felt like a titan had fallen from the heavens and collapsed on the earth. Just about every creature in the surrounding area, that hadn't been killed off by the earthquake, went into panic mode and scampered about in fright. In addition to the destruction that the huge orc's collapse had left in its wake, it had also leveled several trees and an entire grove as it collapsed, flattening an entire mass of land which before now had been a budding forest teeming with vegetation. It had all been surreal. The aftermath of the orc's collapse took about 3 full minutes before all went back to being quiet again. Even in death, the corpse of the chief orc retained a kind of regal majestic ambience. As the dead body of the chief orc lay still on the ground, his eyes remained open as if he was still struggling to understand how it all happened. A permanent look of shock remained plastered on his face. It was clear even up till the end that he never quite understood what had happened. Soaring above the entire debacle that had now quieted down, Xavier finally breathed a sigh of relief. It was a primitive basic human instinct, to relax after a long drawn-out battle. It was finally over, and all Xavier had was relief. Chapter 55 The Ingenious Plan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The last stage of his plan had been a simple concept that was wrapped in ingenuity and innovation. Even now, Xavier still couldn't believe that it had worked so perfectly. It has all started with a simple thought, and like every great idea ever birthed, it had brought forth an extremely pleasant result after being acted upon. Two very significant things had been utilized by Xavier for the encore, a remote control bomb and a mini parachute. The flashbang was a mere ruse. It had served as a buffer for the real trouble that followed. The chief orc, having congratulated himself at the time for successfully protecting his eyes from the vicious glare of the flashbang, didn't realize that he had shot himself in his foot with his own gun by deliberately robbing himself of seeing what was truly happening around him. The ingenious plan by Xavier had been to tie a remote control bomb to a mini parachute. With this in hand, he knew that he couldn't very well just toss it in the direction of the back of the chief orc's head. So, a distraction was necessary. That was where the flashbang came in. Thus, having distracted the chief orc, Xavier threw the not-so-coveted package over the head of the chief orc. The part about the paraglider had been another fine touch to the plan. Xavier didn't choose to glide at that moment just for the fun of it, it had been solely for the purpose of finessing above the chief orc. No. Xavier's choice to glide at that time was strategic. From that height, he could actually afford to adjust the angle of the glide to get the full attention of the chief orc. This was necessary in order for the remote-controlled bomb to detonate at the right time and place. In actuality, the bomb landing at the exact time when the chief orc turned his head was a stroke of pure luck. Like a hungry cheetah going in for the kill, Xavier pounced on the opportunity without any reservation. So, when Xavier's preparedness met the perfect opportunity, execution was perfect by all count. The plan was not a perfect one, not by a long shot. But it was all he had to work with at the time, and it had been a resounding success. In retrospect, Xavier realized that there were so many things that could have gone wrong. As he recounted each one in his mind, he saw clearly in his mind's eye that a lot of things could have gone awry. At the time, it seemed like a good idea to charge down the hillside on his armor motorcycle and climb the arm of the chief orc. Damn it! What in heaven's name was I thinking? Xavier thought to himself as he reflected on the past and ran simulations on what might have happened. The chief orc could have caught him midair and crushed him, his motorcycle could very well have skidded off track. There was a whole cascade of intangible variables that could have influenced the way things had worked out. If all of his daring maneuvers, the issue with the bomb had been the most delicate one. That had been the trigger that had brought everything to place for Xavier. If he had missed by even an inch, he would have been left with disappointment, and a very angry chief orc. But the goddess of good fortune seemed to be on Xavier's side. Everything had fallen into place for him. There had been no hiccups, no regrets. Everything had moved smoothly for Xavier. While Xavier ruminated on the sequence of things that had brought him to this point, he noticed another oddity going down with the dead orc. Xavier sighed inwardly. Even dead, he still continues to cause problems. Xavier tensed and waited for the worst to happen. But the trouble he had expecting never came. The low rumbling which he had both seen and felt wasn't the vibration of an orc about to come back to life. No. It was the sound of the chief orc's body gradually becoming normal again. Like a deflated balloon loosing its girth and pomp, the bloated gigantic form of the chief orc began to gradually reduce at a progressive rate. Xavier hung back from a safe distance and suspiciously watched the reversal. Slowly and slowly, just as nature intended, the chief orc's body soon returned to normal size after about 60 seconds. In place of the once majestic and terrifying humongous form of the notorious chief orc, now lay the cold decaying form of a regular-sized beast. At this point, Xavier truly that it was truly over. So, Xavier honed in on the direction of the deceased chief orc and forced his paraglider down towards the corpse. Blessed with the timeless curse of finesse, Xavier touched down gracefully. It felt good to have the feel of solid ground beneath his feet. It also felt good to have to look at the chief orc, and for once, see a regular-sized beast instead of the ridiculous monstrosity that he had to contend with. Like a victor going in to claim his kill, Xavier casually circled round the corpse of the dead orc. There was no denying it, Xavier wanted bask in the glory of this victory. Only a short while ago, in the heat of battle, Xavier had actually contemplated turning his back to flee from the huge creature. But for some reason, he had persevered. This was the fruit of his perseverance and patience. Having completed his objective here, it made no sense for him to linger any longer. All that remained was for him to snatch his prize. So, Xavier scanned round about, hoping to find the perfect instrument for his next whim. Xavier's wandering eyes seemed to be guided by fate, he didn't need to look too far before his gaze settled on the ideal weapon. The chief orc's axe. Much like its original owner, the axe had also shrunk back to its original size. Instead of the 15-foot axe with an enormous blade, Xavier found himself looking at a normal-sized axe with a regular-looking blade. Even in its small form, it glinted wickedly under the pale silvery light of the moon. Xavier smiled mischievously as he made his way towards it to pick it up. As Xavier grasped the heavy axe from the ground, he couldn't help but recognize the cruel twist of fate in this matter. After all said and done, it seemed fitting that the chief orc's head be chopped off by his own very weapon. As Xavier brandished the chief orc's chief weapon with both hands, he wished blades could tell tales. If this axe could talk, it would sing day and night of the countless women it had made widows. It would weep as it narrated the numerous bone ligaments and skulls it had cracked open at the hands of its master. The more Xavier thought of it, the more convinced he was that this end was truly fitting for the chief orc. So, Xavier approached the still corpse of the chief orc and positioned himself executioner style, above the neck region. Then, after pausing for a few seconds to savor the moment, Xavier lifted up the heavy axe above his own head, and with all his might, he brought it down with full force upon the neck of the chief orc. Xavier knew a little bit about anatomy to know the exact point where the neck was vulnerable. Gravity augmented Xavier full swing and brought the heavy blade of the axe onto the neck of the chief orc with a violent thud. Like knife slicing through butter, the thick fleshy neck of the orc split open. But despite Xavier's full swing, it hadn't come off in one go just as he had expected. Xavier was a killer, but he detested wanton violence. So, understandably, despite his reservations about the dead orc, he was a bit disgusted at the thought of having to hack away at the dead orc's neck just to chop off his head. But unfortunately, he had already begun the tedious job and he had to see it through. Once again, Xavier lifted the axe up, fling more like a butcher in an abattoir than an executioner. Xavier brought down the blade a second time hoping that this second attempt would seal the deal. It didn't. It was only at the fourth try that the severed head rolled off the neck of the corpse. In place of red flesh blood was now deoxygenated dark red blood that lined up the edges of the ugly neck wound. It wasn't a neat job. There was no doubt that Xavier had botched the job of giving it a clean cut, but what was done already. It was now time to get out of there. Chapter 56 Vrumum. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The first thing Xavier did after grabbing the head of the dead orc was to scour the environment for any signs of his trusty armor motorcycle. Getting out of here and back to the others without the armor motorcycle would prove to be a real arduous task. It was imperative that he found it. Xavier began his search. In due time, he traced his jump from the slope on the hillside and found the motorcycle. Apparently, when the chief orc grabbed the motorcycle and saw that it was devoid of Xavier's presence, he angrily tossed it a short distance away as if it had been nothing but wood. Such had been the strength and anger of the entity that Xavier had faced in battle for about 2 nights. In spite of the fact that it had been a collateral damage during Xavier's joust with the chief orc, the armor motorcycle somehow retained its full functions. There wasn't even as much as a dent on the armor motorcycle. Xavier was impressed. Like a protagonist in a motion picture film, riding off into the sunset at the epilogue, Xavier mounted his trusty motorcycle and turned on the ignition. Xavier welcomed the comforting hum of the powerful engine. He revved the engine so more to ascertain its stability. Having satisfied his curiosity, Xavier throttled down hard and surged forward, in the direction of the nearest exit. Turning his back on the sprawled form of the deceased chief orc which lay on the ground, Xavier surged forward at full speed. Vroom! Xavier zoomed off, sprinting down the hill with the wind rushing to meet him and swooshing behind his ears like an airy waterfall. The taste of victory was in mouth. The chief orc had done a good job of leveling the terrain with his collapse, so Xavier didn't have to brave through too much obstacles in order to get to his destination. The loudness of engine announced his presence as he forged ahead without fear or concern as to what might creep out of the woods and rocky hillside before and behind him. The night was almost over. Xavier could see that based on the signs of dawn in the eastern part of the sky. He hadn't slept in almost 36 hours and it was beginning to tell. The rush of adrenaline from the battle which had kept him going was now wearing off, and in its wake was now a fatigue that was more mental than physical. Xavier shook off the feeling and focused instead on the steady dependable humming of his armor motorcycle to keep him in line. In no distant time, the armor motorcycle covered a significant amount of ground, bringing Xavier to the place of rendezvous which the group had agreed on meeting if all went well. Considering the fact that he had the head of the chief orc bobbing up and down in his bag, it was safe to say that all had truly went well. When Xavier's headlights sighted a familiar landmark up ahead, he slowed down a bit and steadily made his way to the large boulder sitting in a very peculiar enclave. Stopping a few meters away from it, Xavier disembarked from his motorcycle. He then took out his prize with one hand and swaggered over to the boulder. If the blaring sound of his roaring engine hadn't announced his presence already, Xavier coughed awkwardly and called out assertively, "It is I, Xavier. Reveal yourself, old man. Enough with the cloak and dagger stuff." There was a short pause, and then came the shuffling of feet and then finally, the dignified form of the old man in robes appeared like a ghost from behind the boulder. He sneered at Xavier as he approached him, "I just had to be sure it was you. One can never be too careful at a precarious time like this." Xavier nodded slightly in agreement and asked, "Where are the women?" Caden raised his voice a little higher than was necessary and called out both of them. When he turned back his gaze to Xavier, a cloud of shocking disbelief eclipsed his dignified face. For the first time, he saw what was in Xavier's right hand and turned pale white. "Xavier, don't tell me, is that?" The orcs who had been cowering in fear spotted the ominous sign in the night sky, and instantly, their terror tripled. It felt like they had been handpicked for destruction by the fates. Like a bunch of wolves howling at the full moon, the remaining orcs began to howl pitifully. All around them, the different notes and volumes of the screams clashed against each other, rolling into one colossal wave of a mournful funeral dirge. It was a cacophony of fearful cries. Caden, Tacy and Adelia watched as a race of beastly creatures, who were notorious for their savagery and cruelty, cowered at the presence of Xavier. It was a sight that they would never forget. In that moment, Xavier looked like a deity. Clad in his all-black garments, his hand which held the flare gun held up high and suspended in the air, with the other 3 posed in formation behind him like vassals, Xavier resembled a scene right out of a legendary fable. With the bright red flare in the sky came the coveted gift of illumination. The plains and the surrounding regions had been clothed with a blanket of the bright, blood-red flare, inadvertently bringing all hidden things into the light. And with this blood-red illumination came the opportunity for the orcs to see the horrible sight that was the decapitated head of the chief orc. The first set of orcs who were brave enough to lift their heads out of their hiding places looked towards the object that had been expected to detonate. The chilling fear that had enveloped them was abated for a while. When they saw that the explosion was delayed, a part of them held on to the hope that maybe it wouldn't come to that. For the first time, they looked closely at the object. The dead chief orc's head, which by all count was monumental and stunning in proportions, gradually came within the full scope the sight of the remaining orcs. All at once, like a simulation that simultaneously envelopes an entire assembly, a sudden wave of realization washed over the orcs. Along with it, the stubborn rage of doubt contended against the truth that was gradually dawning on them. The razor-sharp eyes of the orcs, which thrived in the darkness, immediately discerned the facial expression of their beloved leader, whom they all believed to be invincible. In his lifetime, the powerful orc had been well respected. So, for his subordinates to come to the knowledge of his death in such a crude manner, it was an earth-shattering revelation of an insane proportion. The first shrill cry came out of the already sore throat of a tired orc, another followed, and another, until the whole valley was encased in the mournful cries of the remaining orc. Unfortunately for them, the amputation of their chief's head was only the first of the many deaths to follow. Up above, positioned at a vantage point that was elevated above the mass of bitterness and anguish in the valley below, Xavier stood with his friends. Every single one of them, including Xavier, was fixated on the commotion that was unfolding in the valley below, all except Caden. Caden's stare was one of shock. These days, when it came to Xavier, this pattern of shocking disbelief seemed to have become the norm. Time and again, the young man had proven himself to be something of an enigma, and each time, the old man was left in the dust as he struggled to understand the source of Xavier's strange power. Right now was one of those moments. The old magician was perpetually in a state of awe. Baffled, he wrestled with his own mind in his bid to understand just how Xavier could have unleashed such a magnanimous, high-end explosion and magic. Even Caden couldn't deny the fact that the end result was nothing short of breathtaking. The lightning effects were ethereal, sublime, and almost heavenly. Caden very nearly drove himself mad in his struggle to grasp the concept and hidden mystery behind the vivid display of magic. Xavier. The old man quietly thought, you are the true embodiment of the word mysterious. One day, I will get to the depths of the mystery you have so artfully shrouded yourself in. The magician in Caden had been so distracted by the aurora above him, that he completely lost interest in the chaos unfolding beneath him in the valley. Several feet below the cliff where the group stood, in the orc valley beneath them, the orcs had systematically descended into a state of lawlessness. Logic was nowhere to be found in their midst, pandemonium and commotion ruled in its stead. Like a bunch of fickle-minded toddlers running wild, the orcs went into a kind of chaotic frenzy, scampering about aimlessly, without direction and in absolute fear. Chapter 57. Again you are listening at novelfull.audio. With no one to lead them, and with the death of their revered leader looming over them like an ominous shadow, the remaining orcs surrendered to the all-demanding system of lawlessness. Thus, without even having to launch an attack, Xavier had already spread a neat blend of panic and terror over the gullible orcs. Their leader was gone. There was little to no hope for a better future for them. So, head over heels, they skipped and ran like fire had been set on their backsides. With nothing to live for, they recklessly abandoned their home, they left behind the solidarity of tribe, and they lurched forward with a zeal that could only match that of a deer running from a cheetah. So, the once proud and majestic orc tribe fled before the terror that was Xavier. With her face contorted in a mask of pure avarice, Adelia drank in the scene with the insatiable thirst of a bloodthirsty vampire. The young woman savored the scene, drinking every part in and burning every inch of the picture before her into her memory. In several days to come, when she would retire to her bed on many a night, she would replay this very scene in her head and become intoxicated with the same feeling dangerously coursing through her being. This was more than what she had been promised. Having lost the leadership of their chief, the orcs all dived in different directions. In retrospect, Xavier realized that he might have gone a little overboard with the stunt he had pulled with the flare gun and the head of the chief orc. The effect on the orcs had proven to be more disastrous than he had originally intended. At this stage, it was almost impossible for Xavier to gather them all in one heap to finish them up. But he consoled himself with the fact that maybe it was no longer imperative that they be killed off. Unlike the goblins, individual orcs weren't that much of a threat. Indeed, it could truly be said that true strength of an orc attack lies in their numbers. Orcs loved the comfortable anonymity of being part of a herd. So, as long as their unity was broken, they were little more than just chaff before the wind. The atmosphere at the top of the cliff was in complete contrast to the atmosphere in the valley below. Tacy, Adelia, and even Xavier reveled in the euphoria of victory. It had been a long and arduous journey, and now, right before their very eyes, the victory which had seemed so unattainable had finally materialized. The hunters had become the hunted. Only Caden didn't seem to be in a victorious mood. As a matured mind, he knew that an enemy was at his most dangerous when he appears to be fleeing. The old man couldn't truly bring himself to celebrate yet. As he separated his consciousness from the joy of his environment, he dug into the far reaches of his mind to search for the root of the trouble that was irking him. With a violent start, Caden remembered. Of course, he thought inwardly. How could I have been so carried away? The nagging worry that had been eating deep into his subconscious was none other than the fear for the safety of the group of hunters whom he had left waiting for him in the woods. Unintentionally, Caden had now placed them in the path of the desperate orcs. Caden didn't like the odds of the group having to face the rampage of these frenzied beasts. Worst of all, the only reason why they were at that location was because Caden had pleaded with them to remain there and wait for his return. They never would have been there in the first place if Caden hadn't dragged them into this mission. Right now, they were about to face the vengeful rage of this fleeing band of orcs. With this frightful feeling of guilt threatening to swallow Caden whole, the old man voiced his concerns to the group. Xavier. Quick, we have to get out of here. Xavier gave one of those dramatic shoulder turns and looked at the old man quizzically. Relax, old man, the worst is over now. They can't get us here. Even as Xavier spoke, he knew that the orcs getting to them probably wasn't the issue. But he had to goad the old man into spilling his worries. I am not taking about us. Caden snapped as he replied the younger man. Xavier raised his eyebrows, trying his possible best to follow the old man's thought train. He's referring to the hunters we left behind in the woods, Xavier. Fortunately for Xavier, Tacy chose that exact moment to step in. She slowly brought Xavier up to date on the old man's worries. There's about 24 of them who came out with us on this mission to rescue you. And right now, they are presently camped in the woods not too far away from here. Xavier tensed as he came to terms with the urgency of the situation. Having finally understood, Xavier swerved his head towards Caden. That would mean that they are about to be on the receiving end of a bunch of wrathful orcs. The carnage would be astronomical. We need to get a move on, Xavier. You know what this means, don't you? Of course Xavier knew what it meant both for him and for the old man. If the entire group ended up being slaughtered, then their blood would be on both Xavier and Caden's hands. Damn it. I can't just seem to catch a break. Xavier's annoyance was understandable. Each time he felt like this was all over, he found himself instantly hooked on another branch of trouble. Xavier finally made the call. Alright, let's go everyone. We need to make it in time before the orcs chance on those hunters. Remember that they don't know what had happened here. So hurry up. Let's go. So, despite the group's apparent fatigue, they rushed back with full speed towards the unsuspecting group of hunters who had been left exposed. Everyone surged forward, hoping against hope that the orcs wouldn't get there first before them. Because if they did, there was no band of hunters that would be able to withstand the full force of the orcs who had been stricken by terror. No one prayed harder than Caden. Aside from the fact that he was the proprietor of the underground exchange and these men were his comrades, it also wasn't the fact that this was majorly about business. No, the feeling of dread that haunted Caden, hovering over his every thought, was born out of and fanned by the fires of his PTSD from his younger days. This moment was reminiscent of the time that the chief orc had single-handedly slaughtered almost 3/4 of his circle of hunters back then. It had taken the old man a great many years to put that incident behind him. The loneliness and the feeling of helplessness that followed was crushing. That loss and pain had been a very solid foundation on which Caden had built his character. Over time, the magician had built walls and walls of fortification round about himself to make sure that an event like that never occurred. He went deeper and deeper into magic. He gained for himself the respect and admiration of both peers and seniors. The crowning glory of his efforts was the underground exchange which he had built in honor of his fallen hunter friends. And right now, all of this was threatening to be destroyed as a result of his choice to willingly drag them out here even when they protested that they wanted to leave. As Caden tore through the woods on his feet, dawn greeted the landscape, filling the terrain with the warm glow of the first sun rays of the day. But Caden hadn't been so disinterested in nature and its beauty for such a long time. At the moment, his heart had already left his body, it was waiting for him up ahead, where he had abandoned the hunters. Caden stepped up his pace and broke into a run. He dashed ahead with the energy and strength that one would not expect from a man of his age and dignified status. Before long, he disappeared out of sight, leaving Xavier, Tacy and Adelia in the dust. Xavier cursed under his breath. Damn! This old man. But Xavier couldn't fully grasp Caden's state mind. It wasn't like Xavier couldn't run ahead like Caden, the fact was that he was considerate of the two women with him. Neither of them had had a good night's rest in days, they were exhausted, famished and in need of recuperation time. Also, he couldn't very well abandon them in the middle of the woods, especially when a pack of wrathful orcs were on the prowl. So, at a steady pace, Xavier and the rest covered the distance between them and their destination. Chapter 58 Honor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In good time, after a steady persistence that was worthy of commendation, Xavier and the others finally caught up with Caden. As they approached the scene where the hunters had been asked to wait for Caden, Xavier saw the dignified form of the old man up ahead. From that distance, Caden's robes flapped in the wind of the early morning breeze like a cape. Xavier didn't understand why Caden remained frozen in one spot, why wasn't he moving around to check on the hunters? Was the old man disappointed that they had fled already? These questions raged through Xavier's mind. So, with the old man in full view, Xavier sped up ahead to meet him. He hailed him from afar. "Old man. Are they gone, Aura?" Xavier instantly regretted his presumptuousness. He skidded to a halt when he came to the entrance of the open clearing located in the womb of the forest. An atrocious sight greeted his eyes. Spread out in a haphazard manner were the mangled corpses of the hunters whom Caden had asked to wait for him. In Xavier's time as a member of the Special Forces unit, he had seen his fair share of the destruction that was common with war. But even as he looked upon the dismembered, bleeding bodies of the men who lay before him in death, Xavier saw a different shade of destruction. This level of devastation was morbidly insane, it reeked of cruelty at its worst. Intestines spewed out of so many guts, huge chunks of flesh had been ripped out of the necks of several, leaving their heads barely hanging on. Several bones had been twisted at an unnatural angle. Xavier noticed the bleeding eye sockets on many of the corpses. He looked closer and saw that several eyeballs had been destroyed by plucking out or by forcing in. Xavier was shook. This level of brutality was something he had never seen before. It was only in that moment that he finally understood why the mere mention of the orcs made so many giddy. Tacy and Adelia showed up a couple of minutes later. They too were forced to look upon the horrendous sight. For a full minute, no one spoke. There wasn't even the sound of breathing. The slaughter before them was loud enough. There was simply no words for this. Aside from the others who felt a morbid sense of gloom, Tacy was the only one didn't feel a shred of sympathy for the dead hunters. She knew that they had met their end in the most unconventional manner. But she couldn't bring herself to feel bad for them. The cowardly hunters willingly chose to abandon both her and Caden. And now, the very evil which they had thought wouldn't befall them had taken them unawares. Tacy said nothing about her true feelings. But she maintained an outer front that suggested that she was also horrified, even though she wasn't. A day later, Xavier was fast asleep in his hotel room. He had the serenity and thought of how he would love the peaceful state that he was in to last forever, but fate had other plans for him, and peace was not part of it. His sleep was suddenly interrupted by some disturbances coming from outside the building, voices shouting, the beat from the brim of the drum whenever it got hit with the mallet, singing, and noise from boots hitting the ground uniformly from people's voices singing and jubilating. Excitement filled the air which forced him to come back to reality. He opened his eyes, struggled to hear his thoughts inside of him. He had not even been able to fix his thoughts on the cacophonies that arose from the disturbance outside when he heard a knock on the door. He got up reluctantly and went tingling straight to open the door. He turned the doorknob and pulled lightly to open the door, revealing a familiar face. "Oh, it's you," he murmured as he leaned backward and opened the door wider than he opened before to reveal Adelia's beautiful face smiling radiantly at him. He was not really surprised to see her though, she lived in the next door to his. "Yes, how are you doing today?" she asked excitedly as she let herself into the room uninvited. She walked slowly to the bed, swinging her sexy body to the right and and sat down, gently sinking her beautiful body into the soft bed and laying across her left leg on the right. The shouting and noise outside persisted and it was almost blocking out every other sound, most especially Adelia's girly voice. Xavier had to strain his ears, and his disapproval of it all could be clearly seen on his face. "What is all that hustle and bustle going on outside about?" Xavier asked her gruffly, partially ignoring her question as he was still disturbed by the interruption of his sleep. "It's all because of you, Xavier," she replied to him with more excitement than before. Her face beamed with excitement and it made even Xavier to wonder what had gotten her in that happy mood, although she was always childishly cheerful. "Me? How?" he replied, her looking puzzled. He stretched his arms out, walked to the window to have a good look at the crowd outside making the fuss. They were indeed chanting and singing his praises as they danced with such vigor. He stared at the streets and the people for a while, but this filled him with nothing but absolute discomfort. He didn't feel like the man he always wished to be, cool and calm, but his braveness and straightforwardness has won battles. All he wanted was to rest and enjoy some serenity this time, and he did not want any exposure, not the type that an association with the politicians would bring him eventually. But residing in a border town in Princey State would not provide him with the type of serenity he wanted. "Yes, your deeds have gotten to the ears of the governor," Adelia's sweet voice streamed past his ears and interrupted his line of thoughts. "And he means to honor you with a commendation for your heroic acts. People out there are chanting your praises and celebrating your deeds," she added and smiled from ear to ear, revealing her perfect glowing set of teeth. After appearing to be deep in thoughts for a while, Xavier replied her. "Well, I'm not interested in the politicians and their so-called politics," Xavier replied abruptly as he walked back to the bed, running his finger on the wood of the bed. Xavier would never have anything to do with the government even if the heavens rain fire upon the earth. Their unclean hands has made him realized a lot being a special force agent before transcended. "They are liars and they are not to be trusted," he added, but before he could finish the sentence the military system interrupted him. "You have no choice but to accept the governor's award, Xavier," the system suddenly said to him. The interruption almost made him lash out in anger, changing his expressions into a human beast, like a human hunter, but he maintained a grip on his emotion, a trade trick he had learned in all his years in the special forces in order to hold himself together for the new mission assigned to him. And why must I accept something so irrelevant? Xavier asked angrily, letting his rage out partially. His fury was no longer as contained as before, he was starting to let his anger out a little bit. Xavier knew he had no option but to go because he already knew the outcome of declining mission given to him. It is a vital task that you must complete, that's why, the system replied him almost as quickly as he had asked the question. Well, I am delighted that you're getting a commendation. But I am even more excited that I'm going to meet Erlene. This has been the cause of my excitement all along. Adelia announced dreamily. I miss her so much, she added. This brought curiosity on Xavier's face and prompted him to ask her about this Erlene. Who is Erlene? Xavier asked her as he stared at her with bewilderment written all over his face. He wondered why she would be so excited for him to meet this person and how important the person must be to make her feel such joy. It was a kind of feeling that had begun to feel alien to him since getting to this strange world. She is the governor's daughter and my best friend, she replied him as she giggled brightly. Her beautiful well-carved face became even more beautiful at that moment. Adelia happened to be a maid serving in Erlene's home when she was younger. They grew up together and along the way developed the most wonderful and bond and strong friendship, even though they hailed from different backgrounds and one is supposed to serve the other. Chapter 59 Trigger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Adelia then moved closer to Xavier and placed a pouch in his hand. He checked inside the pouch and found a few dozen gold coins in it, confused when Adelia would have gotten that much of gold coins, but suddenly he looked aghast and Adelia could see it in his eyes. He probably knew where the pouch of gold coins was from before Adelia even told him, giving Adelia a questioning look. Tacy, she entrusted me to deliver these to you, Xavier. Adelia finally revealed to him as she stared into his face. The atmosphere suddenly changed as Adelia could see Xavier's mood totally change. Xavier instantly sank into a gloomy silence for a moment, staring into space and appeared to be lost in thoughts. He then slowly walked to the door and looked back at Adelia where she stood. I'll go with you to the city to accept the commendation, but I have business I must tend to before we go on this journey, he announced. He then walked out of the room, leaving Adelia alone. Adelia looked in the direction he was leaving and seemed to be thinking about something. Xavier headed to the underground exchange in search of Tacy. His mind was full and heavy with thoughts of why Tacy would return the gold coins he gifted to her. Immediately Tacy noticed the presence of Xavier through the voices of men in the exchange, standing in a corner looking suspicious as always, and the tameness of the middle-aged man with load of bandage wrapped tightly over his broken arm, groaning in pain as if his arm just got broken in the sight of Xavier. It was a kind gesture that came purely from his heart and the greatest opportunity that a woman such as Tacy could get in an extremely patriarchal world such as this. The gold coins were supposed to be her golden ticket to a life of affluence, freedom and self-security. Something she would not normally come across easily in this society. He found Tacy at the underground exchange and she seemed to be avoiding him for reasons unknown to him. He thought about what could influence this behavior of hers but could not come up with much. Why would she give up the chance to live a nice life? Actually the reason was the strong emotional connection that Tacy felt towards him. She loved him but she felt that she could not have him to herself. She felt unworthy of such a man. After all, she is just a simple girl with no ambition. All she wanted was to lead a simple life of tranquility, quietness and peace. Greetings, Tacy, he greeted her as she bent her head down, pretending to be busy with work. She avoided looking straight at his strong, perfectly made face or his beautiful eyes. His strong figure and the charisma he commanded all reminded Tacy of why they cannot be together, right there and then she was a prize she could not win. Having been seen a girl as beautiful as Adelia beside Xavier contributed greatly to the way, it made her feel greatly inferior, and seeing him beside her, the man of her dreams that she could not have, trust someone she loved but due inferiority complex, she could not even confess her strong love for Xavier. His presence there filled her with heartache. For a minute, Xavier maintained silence before Tacy finally turned to face his side. "Halo." Xavier began calmly. "Hello, Xavier," she replied, all the while making herself busy with what she had been doing before he showed up, trying to avoid eye contact with him. "You're still here, I see. And you returned the money I gave you to leave this place behind and start a better life somewhere else. Why would you do that?" he referred to her seriously. "I should leave here and go where, Xavier? I'm a simple girl and there ain't much out there for someone like me in this world. All I want is some peace and a simple life free of sorrow and pain," she explained to him, and he felt pity for her. "This has always been the home I knew. I've lived my own life here with Caden and I don't think there is another place better for me to live than here," she answered with a seriousness that matched Xavier's own mood. "Can't you go anywhere but here? Can't you do more with your life?" Xavier protested. "At least I have a life here, Xavier. Out there, there is a lot of chaos and many unknowns. My place is here and I have accepted that." She finally looked up at him and stared into his eyes, and it took her all her strength not to let tears stream down her eyes. "I never demanded anything from anyone other than you come for exchange and I pay your dues as instructed, nothing more than that," she answered in a quiet and straight voice that was barely above yelling. Xavier found himself speechless, as smart as he has always known himself, but this time, he felt the urge of something different. Convinced that Tacy was serious and wasn't just saying this absent-mindedly, Xavier took his time to understand Tacy's statement before he made up his mind. It was at this moment that Xavier realized that there was nothing he could do to convince her to leave. He was not going to force her or anybody else to do things they did not want to do. As Xavier continued consoling Tacy's mind from her emptiness, she lifted her gaze slowly to meet up with Xavier's face, and she found compassion, love and care in his face. Not being able to summon the courage to express her feeling towards Xavier, she quickly buried her face in the ground to quench her curiosity. Tacy has grown affection for Xavier, but she didn't know how best to express her feelings to him. Instead, she determined to keep it all to herself. She was so inferior to face Xavier and confess her true feeling to him. Her low self-esteem killed her pride and courage to walk up to Xavier to confess the love she has for him. She has always been thinking she wasn't good enough for him as a partner, not his perfect mate or his type, yet Xavier was keen to fight her battle to victory. Tacy was transparent in her thought. He watched as a look of realization dawned on her. He felt bad for her, and somehow in his mind he felt responsible for her safety, and so, to make sure that she continued to be safe even in his absence, he reached to his side and unholstered his sidearm and gave it to her. It was a Glock .19. He also gave her a few dozen bullets to go with it. The caliber of this weapon is 9 mm, the round's capacity is 15, and it is concealable. Just the type of weapon a woman needs in this world where animalistic men women and still blame the women for it. He stood up immediately and Tacy looked up surprisingly and anticipate what would happen next. Xavier softly pulled her up and he took a step forward, showcasing the motive to run like a cheater. They both ran out of the underground exchange to an open area. Tacy could not question his ability and instinct of what he had in mind, though she already knew what would happen where were. Xavier released Tacy's hand and took some steps forward to check for a perfect view where his plan would work as expected. "Here we are," he said. "Where is this place?" Tacy asked. "Why are we here anyway?" Tacy's asked with the act of pretense being a hoodwink. "Okay Tacy, listen and listen well. There must not be mistake here or you are dead," Xavier said confidently. Xavier handed Tacy his pistol slowly and carefully. After the pistol is in her hand, Xavier let go of the pistol calmly. "Take a closer look at me and do exactly as I do," Xavier instructed flatly. Then he continued. "I'll teach you to use this weapon, Tacy. It should at least keep you safe if you're choosing to stay here. he put the gun in her hand and she stared at it while he searched for a clearing with the intention of training her to use it. He then took the gun from her and began to show her. The first thing you do is click the safety off and point, aim and pull the trigger. He clicked the safety off as he had said, pointed and shot at some trees. The sound of the firearm made Tacy shake a little bit and then Xavier offered her the weapon, whispering, "Now it's your turn, Tacy." She took the gun and followed Xavier's instructions. She pulled the trigger and fired the gun. She missed some few times as the recoil of the gun shook her hands and the gun even fell off her hand once. Chapter 60. Leave. You are listening at novelfull.audio. But as she continued to practice, she started to get a grip of the weapon and was later able to make some nice shots. She was finally able to make some nice shots. She shot through some objects, smiling a little as she also shot some bullets into some trees. This powerful instrument of destruction, the power it has and the respect it commanded fascinated her so much. Xavier knew the gun would have this effect and that was why he gifted her the gun. He wanted to help her in boosting her self-esteem and a gun was his only option for doing it, being the Special Forces soldiers that he was. "Okay, Tacy, listen and listen well. There must not be mistake here or you are dead," Xavier said confidently. Xavier handed Tacy his pistol slowly and carefully. After the pistol is in her hand, Xavier let go of the pistol calmly. "Take a closer look at me and do exactly as I do," Xavier instructed flatly. Then he continued. "There are 5 rules guiding the usage of this pistol in your hands. Number 1 is keep your grip high and tight." He stopped for a while and continued. "How you hold the handgun is key to controlling recoil and can even slightly make up for a sloppy trigger pull. Unfortunately, the grip is also one of the things that shooters tend to get wrong. If you pull this gun on someone or some people, Tacy, then you must be ready to really use it. This is the power over life and death in the palms of your hands," Xavier explained to her. The most popular handgun stances include the isosceles, the Weaver and the Chapman. There is no best stance. All 3 have their advantages and disadvantages. Experiment with different stances and choose one that you feel most comfortable with. When holding a handgun, your grip should be high and tight, meaning there should be no spaces between your flesh and the gun when you grip it. Having spaces in between your hand and the gun means that there is room for the gun to move when it recoils. The web of your hand should go as high as possible without interfering with the slide, and your non-dominant hand should come forward to fill the empty space on the grip panel. Get your stance right. He stopped for a while to see if she was getting it or not and then he continued. Fast and accurate handgun shooting demands a stable shooting stance. A proper handgun shooting stance will set you up for success in other areas, such as sight alignment, trigger control and recoil management. And the number 3 is use the front side. You got that. He stopped for a while to see if she was getting it right but Tacy was busy adjusting hands and head to focus on her target while Xavier continued taking 3 steps backward. One of the biggest mistakes that beginner shooters tend to make is looking directly at their target as opposed to their front sight. If you're shooting for pure accuracy, you need to line up the front and rear sights. The front sight should be in clear focus, while the rear sights are somewhat fuzzy. Don't pull the trigger until you see that your sights are aligned. This will only instill bad shooting habits that will be hard to break. He paused and watched her sigh in understanding of all what he has been saying. Another rule is work on recoil anticipation. It is necessary. Recoil anticipation screws up a lot of handgunners. This is one of the reasons why dry firing, shooting without live ammo, is so important because it helps build muscle memory that can help you overcome recoil anticipation. If you find yourself flinching in anticipation of the recoil, try to pull the trigger as if you were just dry firing it and let the gun do its thing. Dry firing is perfectly safe for the most part, the exception being the rimfire guns, and can significantly improve your handgun accuracy. Keep in mind that the 4 rules of gun safety still apply to dry firing. So when you're finished dry firing your pistol, be sure to immediately return it to the pistol case. People have dry firing accidents when they get distracted, load their firearm and return to dry firing, only to experience a loud bang. A handgun case can help prevent unnecessary accidents. And another is to earn proper trigger squeeze or press. Xavier observed Tacy's seriousness to learn shoot fast, and he increased his energy in teaching her. He continued, despite trigger pull being one of the most important aspects of handgun shooting, it's often easily neglected by beginner and experienced shooters alike. If you have your sights lined up and your shot is still veering off the left or the right, an improper trigger pull is probably to blame. That's the end of today's practice, Xavier noted. After teaching Tacy how to use a gun, it was time for Xavier to leave the underground exchange behind and head to City Victoria, the capital city of Princey State. The thought of him leaving started to weigh heavily on Tacy, and although she didn't want him to leave, she finally accepted the inevitability of his departure and they both waved each other goodbye. The very next day, Xavier woke up in fresh sheets and a warm bed for the first time in a really long while. His adventures had deprived him of some of the basic comforts of life, so Xavier took his time to savor the feeling before slipping out of bed. His eyes opened to the comfort of the hotel room and drank in the comely ambience of the loftiness of the space. The lighting from the morning sun which filtered in from the window facing east covered the room in a kind of golden glow. The golden rays bounced off the white cotton sheets, the white walls and the white sculptures, making it seem like he had woken up in paradise.